Hello, Internet. The voice of Mike Bertolini here, and I'm here to read you a story. This story is both captivating in its horror and its excitement. Remember to subscribe, hit that like button, leave a comment below, let me know what you think about this story. So, without any further ado, let's just get into the story. This is The Faceless God by Robert Bloch. The thing on the torture rack began to moan. There was a grating sound as the lever stretched the iron bed still one more space in length. The moaning grew to a piercing shriek of utter agony. "Ah," said Dr. Stugach, "we have him at last." He bent over the tortured man on the iron grill and smiled tenderly into the anguished face. His eyes, tinged with delicate amusement, took in every detail of the body before him. The swollen legs, raw and angry from the embrace of the fiery boot, the lacerated back and shoulders, still crimson from the kiss of the lash, the bloody, mangled remnants of a chest crushed by the caress of the spiked coffin. With gentle solicitude, he surveyed the finishing touches applied by the rack itself. The dislocated shoulders and twisted torso, the crushed and broken fingers, and the dangling tendons in the lower limbs. Then he turned his attention to the old man's tormented countenance once again. He laughed, softly, in a voice like the tinkling of a bell. Then he spoke. "Well, Hassan, I do not think you will prove stubborn any longer in the face of such eloquent persuasion. Come now, tell me where I can find this idol of which you speak." The butchered victim began to sob, and the doctor was forced to kneel beside the bed of pain in order to understand his incoherent mumblings. For perhaps 20 minutes the creature groaned on, and then at last fell silent. Dr. Stugach rose to his feet once more, a satisfied twinkle in his genial eyes. He made a brief motion to one of the blacks operating the rack machinery. The fellow nodded and went over to the living horror on the instrument. He was crying now. Its tears were blood. The black drew his sword. It swished upward and cleaved down once again. There was a dull sound of crunching impact, and then a tiny fountain spurted upward, spreading a scarlet blot across the wall behind. Dr. Stugach went out of the room, bolted the door behind him, and climbed the steps to the house above. As he raised the bar trap door, he saw that the sun was shining. The doctor began to wisp. He was very pleased. He had good reason to be. For several years, the doctor had been what is vulgarly known as an adventurer. He had been a smuggler of antiques, an exploiter of labor in the Upper Nile, and had at times sunk so low as to participate in the forbidden black goods trade that flourished at certain ports along the Red Sea. He had come out to Egypt many years ago as an attaché on an archaeological expedition, from which he had been summarily dismissed. The reason for his dismissal is not known, but it was rumored that he had been caught trying to appropriate certain of the expeditionary trophies. After his exposure and subsequent disgrace, he had disappeared for a while. Several years later, he had come back to Cairo and set up an establishment in the native quarter. It was here that he fell into the unscrupulous habits of business, which had earned for him a dubious reputation and a sizable profit. He seemed well satisfied with both. At the present time, he was a man of perhaps 45 years of age, short and heavy set, with a bullet-shaped head that rested on broad, ape-like shoulders. His thick torso and bulging paunch were supported by a pair of spindly legs that contrasted oddly with the upper portions of his beefy body. Despite his Falstaffian appearance, he was a hard and ruthless man. His piggish eyes were filled with greed, his fleshy mouth was lustful, his only natural smile was one of avarice. It was the covetous nature that had led him to his present adventure. Ordinarily, he was not a credulous man. The usual tales of lost pyramids, Buried treasure and stolen mummies did not impress him. He preferred something more substantial, a contraband consignment of rugs, a bit of smuggled opium, something in the line of illicit human merchandise. These were things he could appreciate and understand. But this case was different. Extraordinary as it sounded, it meant big money. Stugach was smart enough to know that many of the great discoveries of Egyptology had been prompted by just such wild rumors as the one he had heard. He also knew the difference between improbable truth and spurious invention. This story sounded like the truth. In brief, it ran as follows. A certain party of nomads, while engaged in a secret journey with a cargo of legitimately obtained goods, were traversing a special route of their own. They did not feel that the regular caravan lanes were helpful for them to follow. While traveling near a certain spot, they had accidentally espied a curious rock or stone in the sands. The thing had evidently been buried, but long years of shifting and swirling among the dunes above it had served to uncover a portion of the object. They had stopped to inspect it at closer range, and thereby made a startling discovery. The thing projecting from the sand was the head of a statue, an ancient Egyptian statue with the triple crown of a god. Its black body was still submerged, but the head seemed to be in perfect preservation. It was a very peculiar thing, that head, and none of the natives could or would recognize the deity, but the caravan leaders questioned them closely. The whole thing was an unfathomable mystery. A perfectly preserved statue of an unknown god buried all alone in the southern desert, a long way from any oasis, 200 miles from the smallest village. Evidently, the caravan men realized something of its uniqueness, for they ordered that 2 boulders lay nearby be placed on top of the idol as a marker in case they ever returned. The men did as they were ordered, though they were obviously reluctant and kept muttering prayers beneath their breath. They seemed very much afraid of the buried image, but only reiterated their ignorance when questioned further concerning it. After the boulders had been placed, the expedition was forced to journey on, for time did not permit them to unearth the curious figure in its entirety, or attempt to carry it with them. When they returned to the north, they told their story, and, as most tales were in the habit of doing, it came to the ears of Dr. Stugach. Stugach thought fast. It was quite evident that the original discoverers of the idol did not attach any great importance to their find. For this reason, the doctor might easily return to the spot and unearth the statue without any trouble, once he knew exactly where it was located. Stugach felt that it was worth finding. If it had been a treasure yarn, now, he would have scoffed and hesitantly put it down as a cock and bull story of the usual variety, but an idol, that was different. He could understand why an ignorant band of Arab smugglers might ignore such a discovery. He could also realize that such discovery might prove more valuable to him than all the treasure in Egypt. It was easy for him to remember the vague clues and wild hints that had prompted the findings of early explorers. They had followed up many blind leads when they plumbed the pyramids and racked the temple ruins. All of them were tomb looters at heart, but their ravishings had made them rich and famous. Why not him, then? If the tale were true, this idol not only buried, but totally unknown as a deity, in perfect condition, and in such an out-of-the-way locality, these facts would create a furor that he exhibited his find. He would be famous. Who knew what hitherto untrodden fields he might open up in archaeology? It was well worth chancing. But he must not arouse any suspicion. He dared not inquire about the place from any Arabs who had been there. That would immediately cause talk. No, he must get his directions from a native in the band. Accordingly, 2 of his servants picked up Hassan, the old camel driver, and brought him before Stugach in his house. But Hassan, when questioned, was very much afraid. He refused to talk, so Stugach conducted him into his reception room in the cellar, where he had been wont to entertain certain recalcitrant guests in the past. Here, the doctor, whose knowledge of anatomy stood him in good stead, was able to cajole his visitor into speaking by the methods we've just witnessed. So Dr. Stugach emerged from the cellar in a very pleasant frame of mind. He was rubbing his fat hands when he looked at the map to verify his information, and he went out to dinner with a smiling face. 2 days later, he was ready to start. He had hired a small number of natives so as not to excite undue investigation, and given out to his business acquaintances that he was about to embark on a special trip. He engaged a strange dragoman and made sure that the fellow would keep his mouth shut. There were several swift camels in the train, and a number of extra donkeys harnessed to a large empty cart. He took food and water for 6 days, for he intended to return via riverboat. After the arrangements were completed, the party assembled one morning in a certain spot unknown to official eyes, and the expedition began. It was on the morning of the 4th day that they arrived at last. Stugach saw the stones from his precious perch atop the leading camel. He swore delightedly, and despite the hovering heat, dismounted and raced over to the spot where the 2 boulders lay. A moment later, he called the company to a hasty halt and issued orders for the immediate erection of the tents and the usual preparations for encampment. Utterly disregarding the intolerable warmth of the day, he saw to it that the sweating natives did a thorough job, and then, without allowing them a moment's rest, he instructed them to remove the massive rocks from their resting place. A crew of straining men managed to topple them over at last and clear the way to the underlying sand. In a few moments, there was a loud cry from the gang of laborers as a black and sinister head came into view. It was a triple-crowned blasphemy. Great spiky cones adorned the top of the ebony diadem, and beneath them were hidden intricately executed designs. He bent down and examined them. They were monstrous, both in subject and in execution. He saw the writhing, worm-like shapes of primal monsters and headless, slimy creatures from the stars. There were blooded beasts in the robes of men, and ancient Egyptian gods in hideous combat with squirming demons from the Gulf. Some of the designs were foul beyond description, and others hinted of unclean terrors that were old when the world was young. But all were evil, and Stugach, cold and callous though he was, could not gaze at them without feeling a horror that ate his brain. As for the natives, they were openly frightened. The moment that the top of the image came into view, they began to jabber hysterically. They retreated to the side of the excavation and began to argue and mumble, pointing occasionally at the statue or at the kneeling figure of the doctor. Absorbed by his inspection, Stugach failed to catch the body of their remarks, or note the air of menace from which radiated from the sullen dragoman. Once or twice he heard some vague references to the name Nyarlathotep, and a few allusions to the demon messenger. After completing his scrutiny, the doctor rose to his feet and ordered the men to proceed with the excavation. No one moved, and patiently he repeated his command. The natives stood by, their heads hung, but their faces were stolid. At last, the dragoman stepped forward and began to harangue the Effendil. He and his men would never have come with their master had they known what they were expected to do. They would not touch the statue of the god, and they warned the doctor to keep his hands off. It was bad business to incur the wrath of the old god, the secret one. But perhaps he had not heard of Nyarlathotep. He was the oldest god of all Egypt, of all the world. He was the god of resurrection and the black messenger of Carnetter. There was a legend that one day he would arise and bring the olden dead to life, and his curse was one to be avoided. Stugach, listening, began to lose his temper. Angrily he interrupted, ordering the men to stop gawking and resume their work. He backed up this command with 2 Colt 37 revolvers. He would take all the blame for this desecration, he shouted, and he was not afraid of any damned stone idol in the world. The natives seemed properly impressed, both by the revolvers and by his fluent profanity. They began to dig again, timidly averting their eyes from the statue's form. few hours later, work sufficed for the men to uncover the idol. If the crown of its stony head had hinted of horror, the face and bodily openly proclaimed it. The image was obscene and shockingly malignant. There was an incredibly alien quality about it. It was ageless, unchanging, eternal. Not a scratch marred its black and crudely chiseled surface. During all its many-centuried burial, there had been no weathering upon the fiendishly carven figures. Stugach saw it now as it must have looked when it was first buried, and the sight was not good to see. It resembled the miniature sphinx. A life-size sphinx with its wings of a vulture and the body of a hyena. There were talons and claws, and upon the squatting bestial body rested a massive anthropomorphic head, bearing the ominous triple crown whose dread designs had so singularly excited the natives. But the worst and by far the most hideous feature was the lack of a face upon the ghastly thing. It was a faceless god, the winged, faceless god of ancient myth, Nyarlathotep, mighty messenger, stalker among the stars, and lord of the desert. When Stugach completed his examination at last, he became hysterically happy. He grinned triumphantly into that blank and loathsome countenance, grinned into that faceless orifice that yawned as vacantly as the black void beyond the suns. In his enthusiasm, he failed to notice the furtive whispers of the natives and the guides, and disregarded their fearsome glances at the unclean eidolon. Had he not done so, he would have been a wiser man, for these men knew, as all Egypt knows, that Nyarlathotep is the master of evil. Not for nothing had his temples been demolished, his statues destroyed, and his priestcraft crucified in the olden days. There were dark and terrible reasons for prohibiting his worship and omitting his name from the Book of the Dead. All references to the Faceless One were long since deleted from the sacred manuscripts, and great pains had been taken to ignore some of his godly attributes, or assign them to some milder deity. In thought, Set, Bubastis, and Sebek. In Thoth, Set, Bubastis, and Sebek, we can trace some of the master's grisly endowments. It was he, in the most archaic of the chronicles, who was ruler of the underworld. It was he who became the patron of sorcery and the black arts. Once he alone had ruled, and men knew him in all lands, under many names. But that time passed. Men turned away from the worship of evil and reverenced the god. They did not care for the gruesome sacrifices the dark god commanded, nor the way his priests ruled. At last the cult was suppressed, and by common consent all references to it were forever banned, and its records destroyed. But Nyarlathotep had come out of the desert, according to the legend, and to the desert he now returned. Idols were set up in hidden places among the sands, and there the thin, fanatical ranks of true believers still leapt and capered in naked worship, with the cries of shrieking victims echoed only in the airs of the night. So his legend remained and was handed down in the secret ways of the earth. Time passed. In the north the ice floe receded and Atlantis fell. New peoples overran the land, but the desert folk remained. They viewed the building of the pyramids with amused and cynical eyes. Wait, they counseled. When the day arrived at last, Nyarlathotep would come out of the desert, and then woe unto Egypt. For the pyramids would shatter into dust, and temples crumble to ruin. Sunken cities of the sea would rise, and there would be famine and pestilence throughout the land. The stars would change in a most peculiar way, so that the great ones could come pulsing from the outer gulf. Then the beasts could give tongue and prophecy in anthropoglyphism that man shall perish. By these signs and other apocalyptic portents, the world would know that Nyarlathotep had returned. Soon he himself would be visible. A dark, faceless man in black, walking, staff in hand, across the desert, but leaving no track to mark his way, save that of death. For wherever his footsteps turned, men would surely die, until at last none but true believers remained, to welcome him in worship with the mighty ones from the Gulf. Such, in its essence, was the fable of Nyarlathotep. It was older than secret Egypt, more hoary than sea-doomed Atlantis, more ancient than time-forgotten Mu, but it has never been forgotten. In the medieval times, the story and its prophecy were carried across Europe by returning crusaders. Thus, the mighty messenger became the black man of the witch covens, the emissary of Asmodeus and darker gods. His name is mentioned cryptically in the Necronomicon, for Hauser had heard it whispered in tales of Shadow Realm. The fabulous Book of Iban hints at the myth and veiled in diverse ways, for it was written a far-off time when it was not yet deemed safe to speak of things that had walked upon the earth when it was young. Ludwig Prynne, who traveled in Saracenic lands and learned strange sorceries, awesomely implies his knowledge in the infamous mysteries of the worm. But his worship, in late years, seems to have died out. There is no mention of it in Sir James Fraser's Golden Bough, and most reputable ethnologists and anthropologists are frankly ignorant of the Faceless One's history. But there are idols still intact, and some whisper of certain caverns beneath the Nile, and of burrows below the ninth pyramid. The secret signs and symbols of his worship are gone, but there are some undecipherable hieroglyphs in the government vaults which are very closely concealed, and men know. By word of mouth, the tale has come down through the ages, and there are those who still wait for the day. By common consent, there seem to be certain spots in the desert which are carefully avoided by caravans, and several secluded shrines are shunned by those who remember, for Nyarlathotep is the god of the desert, and his ways are best left unprofaned. It was this knowledge which prompted the uneasiness of the natives upon the discovery of that peculiar idol in the sand. When they had first noted the headdress, they had been afraid, and after seeing that featureless face, they became frantic with dread. As for Dr. Stugach, his fate did not matter to them. They were concerned only with themselves, and their course was plainly apparent. They must flee, and flee at once. Stugach paid no attention to them. He was busy making plans for the following day. They would place the idol on a wheeled cart and harness the donkeys. Once back to the river, it could be put on board the steamer. What a find! He conjured up pleasant visions of the fame and fortune that would be his. Scavenger was he, a savory adventure. Charlatan, cheat, imposter, they called him. How those smug official eyes would pop when they beheld his discovery. Heaven only knew what vistas this might open up for him. There might be other altars, other idols, tombs and temples too, perhaps. He knew vaguely that there was some absurd legend about the worship of this deity, but he could only get his hands on a few more natives who can give him the information he wanted. He smiled, musing. Funny, those superstitious myths. The boys were afraid of the statue. That was plainly apparent. The dragoman, now, with his stupid quotations. How did it go? Nyarlathotep is the black messenger of Karneter. He comes from out of the desert, across the burning sands, and stalks his prey throughout the world, which is the land of his domain. Silly. All Egyptian myths were stupid. Statues with animal heads suddenly coming to life, reincarnations of men and gods, foolish kings building pyramids for mummies. Well, a lot of fools believed it. Not only the natives either. He knew some cranks who credited the stories about the pharaoh's curse and the magic of the old priests. There were a lot of wild tales about the ancient tombs and the men who died when they invaded. No wonder his own simple natives believed such trash. But whether they believed it or not, they were going to move his idol, damn them, or he had to shoot them down to make them obey. He went into his tent, well satisfied. The boy served him his meal, and Stagach dined heartily as he wont. He decided to retire early, in anticipation of his plans for the following morning. The boys could tend to the camp, he decided. Accordingly, he lay down on his cot and soon fell into a contented, peaceful slumber. It must have been several hours later that he woke. It was very dark, and the night was strangely still. Once he heard the faraway howl of a hunting jackal, but it soon blended into a somber silence. Surprised at his sudden awakening, Stagach rose and went to the door of the tent, pulling the flap to gaze into the open. A moment later, he cursed his frenzied rage. The camp was deserted. The fire had died out. The men and camels had disappeared. Footprints, already half obliterated by the sands, showed the silent haste in which the natives had departed. The fools had left him here alone. He was lost. The knowledge sent a sudden stab of fear to his heart. Lost? The men were gone. The food was gone. The camels and donkeys had disappeared. He had neither weapons nor water, and he was all alone. He stood before the door of the tent and gazed, terrified, at the vast and lonely desert. The moon gleamed like a silver skull in an ebony sky. A sudden hot wind ruffled the endless oceans of sand and sent it skirling in tiny waves at his feet. There came silence, ceaseless silence. It was like the silence of the tombs, like the eternal silence of the pyramids, where in crumbling sarcophagi the mummies lie, their dead eyes gazing into unchanging and unending darkness. He felt indescribably small and lonely there in the night. He was conscious of strange and baleful powers that were weaving the threads of his destiny into a final tragic pattern. Nyarlathotep, he knew, and was wreaking an immutable vengeance. But that was nonsense. He must not let himself be troubled by some fantastic rubbish. There was just another form of desert mirage, a common enough delusion under such circumstances. He must not lose his nerve now. He must face the facts calmly. The men had absconded with the supplies and the horses because of some crazy native suspicion. That was real enough. As for the superstition itself, he must not let it bother him. Those frantic and morbid fancies of his would vanish quickly enough with the morning sun. The sun! A terrible thought assailed him. The fearsome reality of the desert at midday. To reach an oasis, he would be forced to travel day and night before the lack of food and water weakened him so that he could not go on. There would be no escape once he left his tent. No refuge from that pitiless blazing eye whose glaring rays could scorch his brain to madness. To die in the heat of the desert, that was an unthinkable agony. He must get back. His work was not yet completed. There must be a new expedition to recover the idol. He must get back. Besides, Stagach did not want to die. His fat lips quivered with fear as he thought of the pain, the torture. He had no desire to suffer the anguish of that fellow he had put on the rack. The poor devil had not looked very pleasant there. No, death was not for the doctor. He must hurry. But where? He gazed around frantically, trying to get his bearings. The desert mocked him with its monotonous, inscrutable horizon. For a moment, black despair clutched at his brain, and then came a sudden inspiration. He must go north, of course. And he recalled, now, the chance words let fall by the dragoman that afternoon. The statue of Nyarlathotep faced north. Jubilantly, he ransacked the tent for any remnants of food or provisions. There were none. Matches and tobacco he carried, and in his kit he found a hunting knife. He was almost confident when he left the tent. The rest of the journey would now be childishly simple. He would travel all night and make as much time as he could. His packed blanket would probably shield him from the noonday sun tomorrow. In the late afternoon he would resume his course, but after the worst of the heat had abated. By quick marches tomorrow night, he ought to find himself near the Wadi Hasur oasis upon the following morning. All that remained for him to do was to get out to the idol and set his course, since the tracks of his party in the sand were already obscured. Triumphantly, He strode across the camp clearing to the excavation where the image stood, and it was there that he received his greatest shock. The idol had been reinterred. The workmen had not left the statue violated, but had completely filled in the excavation, even taking the precaution of placing the two original stones over the top. Sketch could not move them single-handed, and when he realized the extent of this calamity, he was filled with an overpowering dismay. He was defeated. Cursing would do no good, and in his heart he could not even hope to pray, Nyarlathotep, Lord of the Desert. It was with a new and deathly fear that he began his journey, choosing a course at random and hoping against hope that the sudden clouds would lift so that he could have the guidance of the stars. But the clouds did not lift, and only the moon grimly down at the stumbling figure struggled throughout the sand. Dervish dreams flitted through Stagach's consciousness as he walked. Try as he might, the legend of the god haunted him with a sense of impending fulfillment. Vainly he tried to force his drugged mind to forget the suspicions that tormented it. He could not. Over and over again he found himself shivering with fear at the thought of a godly wrath pursuing him to his doom. He had violated a sacred spot, and the old ones remember. His ways are best left unprofaned. God of the desert, the empty continents. Stagach swore viciously and lumbered on, a tiny ant amid mountains of undulating sand. Suddenly it was daylight. The sand faded from purple to violet, then suddenly suffused with an orchid glow. But Stagach did not see it, for he slept. Long before he had planned, his bloated body had given way beneath the grueling strain, and the coming of dawn found him utterly weary and exhausted. His tired legs buckled under him, and he collapsed upon the sand, barely managing to draw the blanket over him before he slept. The sun crept across the brazen sky like a fiery ball of lava, pouring its molten rays upon the flaming sands. Stagach slept on, but his sleep was far from pleasant. The heat brought him queer and disturbing dreams. In them he seemed to see the figure of Nyarlathotep pursuing him on a nightmare flight across a desert of fire. He was running over a burning plain, unable to stop, while searing pain ate into his charred and blackened feet. Behind him strode the Faceless God, urging him onward with a staff of serpents. He ran on and on, but always that gruesome presence kept coming behind him. His feet became numbed by the scorching agony of the sand. Soon he was hobbling on ghastly, crumpled stumps, but despite the torture he dared not stop. The thing behind him cackled in diabolical mirth, his gigantic laughter rising to the blazing sky. Stagach was on his knees now, his crippled legs eaten away into ashy stumps that smoldered acridly even as he crawled. Suddenly, the desert became a lake of living flame to which he sank, his scorched body consumed by a blast of livid, unendurable torment. He felt the sand lick pitilessly at his arms, his waist, his very throat, and still his dying senses were filled with the monstrous dread of the faceless one behind him, a dread transcending all pain. Even as he sank into that white-hot inferno he was feebly struggling on, the vengeance of the god must never overtake him. The heat was overpowering him now. It was frying his cracked and bleeding lips, transforming his scorched body into one ghastly ember of burning anguish. He raised his head for the last time before his boiling brain gave way beneath the agony. There stood the Dark One, and even as Stagach watched, he saw the lean, taloned hands reach out to touch his fiery face, saw the dreadful triple-crowned head draw near to him, so that he gazed for one grisly moment into that empty countenance. As he looked, he seemed to see something in that black pit of horror, something that was staring at him from illimitable gulfs beyond, something with great flaming eyes that bored into his being with a fury greater than the fires that were consuming him. It told him, wordlessly, that his doom was sealed. Then came a burst of white-hot oblivion, and he sank into the seething sands, the blood bubbling in his veins, but the indescribable horror of that glimpse remained, and the last thing he remembered was the sight of that dreadful, empty countenance and the nameless fear behind it. Then he awoke. For a moment, his relief was so great that he did not notice the sting of the midday sun. Then, bathed in perspiration, he staggered to his feet and felt the stabbing rays bite into his back. He tried to shield his eyes and glance above to get his bearings, but the sky was a ball of fire. Desperately, he dropped the blanket and began to run. The sand was clinging to his feet, slowing his pace and tripping him. It burned his heels. He felt an intolerable thirst. Already the demons of delirium danced madly in his head. He ran, endlessly, and his dream seemed to become a menacing reality. Was it coming true? His legs were scorched. His body was seared. He glanced behind him. Thank God there was no figure there. Yet. Perhaps, if he kept a grip on himself, he might still make it, in spite of the time he had lost. He raced on. Perhaps a passing caravan, but no. It was far out of the caravan route. Tonight the sunset would give him an accurate course. Tonight. Damn the heat. Sand all around him, hills of it, mountains, all alike they were, like the crumbled cyclopean ruins of Titan cities. All were burning, smoldering in the fierce heat. The day was endless. Time, ever an illusion, lost all meaning. Stagach's weary body throbbed in bitter anguish, filling each moment with a new and deeper torment. The horizon never changed. No mirage marred the cruel eternal vistas. No shadow gave solace from the savage glare. But wait, was there not a shadow behind him? Something dark and shapeless gloated at the back of his brain. A terrible thought pierced him with sudden realization. Nyarlathotep. God of the desert! A shadow following him, driving him to destruction. Those legends, the natives warned him, his dreams warned him, even that dying creature on the rack. The mighty messenger always claims his own. A black man with a staff of serpents. He cometh from out the desert, across the burning sands, and Stophagus, his prey throughout the land of his domain. Hallucination? Said he glanced back. He turned his fever-addled head. Yes, it was true. This time. There was something behind him, far away on the slope below. Something black and nebulous that seemed to pad on stealthy feet. With a muttered curse, Stagach began to run. Why had he ever touched that image? If he got out of this, he would never return to the accursed spot again. Legends were true. God of the desert. He ran on, even though the sun showed bloody kisses on his brow. He was beginning to go blind. There were dazzling constellations whirling before his eyes, and his heart throbbed a shrieking rhythm in the breast. But in his mind there was room for one thought. Escape. His imagination began playing him strange tricks. He seemed to see statues in the sand, statues like the one he had profaned. Their shapes towered everywhere, rising giant-like out of the ground and confronting his path with eerie menace. Some were attitudes with springs outspread. Others were tentacled and snake-like, but all were faceless and triple-crowned. He felt that he was going mad, until he glanced back and saw that creeping figure not only a half-mile behind. Then he staggered on, screaming incoherently at the grotesque eidolons bearing their way. The desert seemed to take on a hideous personality, as though all nature were conspiring to conquer him. Contorted outlines of the sand became imbued with malignant consciousness. The very sun took on an evil life. Stagach moaned deliriously. Would night ever come? It came at last. By that time, Stagach did not know it anymore. He was a shambling, raving thing, wandering over the shifting sand, and the rising moon looked down on the thing that ultimately howled and laughed. Presently, the figure struggled to its feet and glanced furtively over his shoulder at a shadow that crept close. Then began to run again, shrieking over and over again the single word, Nyarlathotep, and all the while the shadow lurking just a step behind. It seemed to be embodied with a strange and fiendish intelligence, for the shapeless adumbration carefully drove its victim forward in one definite direction. as if purposefully hurting it toward an intended goal. The stars now looked upon a sight spawned of delirium, a man, chased across endlessly looming sands by a black shadow. Presently the pursued one came to the top of a hill and halted with a scream. The shadow paused in midair and waited, seeming to watch. Stugach was looking down at the remains of his own camp, just as he had left it the night before, with the sudden awful realization that he had been driven in a circle back to the starting point. Then, with the knowledge, came a merciful mental collapse. He threw himself forward in one final effort to elude the shadow, and raced straight for the 2 stones where the statue was buried. Then occurred that which he had feared, for even as he ran, the ground before him quaked in the throes of a gigantic upheaval. The sand rolled in vast, engulfing waves, away from the base of the 2 boulders. Through the opening rose the idol, glistening evilly in the moonlight, and the oncoming sand from its base caught Stugach as he ran towards it, sucking at his legs like quicksand, and yawning at his waist. At the same instant, the peculiar shadow rose and leapt forward. It seemed to merge with the statue in midair, a nebulous, animate mist. Then Stugach, floundering in the grip of the sand, went quite insane with terror. The formless statue gleamed living in the livid light, and the doomed man stared straight into the unearthly countenance. It was his dream come true, for behind the mask of stone he saw a face with eyes of yellow madness, and in those eyes he read death. The black figure spread its wings against the hells and sank into the sand with a thunderous crash. Thereafter nothing remained above the earth, save a living head that twisted on the ground and struggled futilely to free its imprisoned body from the iron embrace of the encircling sand. Its imprecations turned to frantic cries for mercy, and sank to a sob in which echoed the single word, Nyarlathotep. The morning came, Stugach was still alive, and the sun baked his brain into a hell of crimson agony, but not for long. The vultures winged across the desert plain and descended upon him, almost as if supernaturally summoned. Somewhere, buried in the sands below, an ancient idol lay, and upon its featureless countenance there was the faintest hint of a monstrous, hidden smile. For even as Stugach, the unbeliever, died, his mangled lips paid whispered homage to Nyarlathotep, Lord of the Desert.